talking about Sufism Reoriented in America.
Jai Baba, everyone.
Jai Baba.
This is very, very interesting. Very interesting. Unraveling the mysteries of Baba's networked links that led to here. And I find it fascinating. There's still some mysteries. Michael and the gang have done a great job. I mean, clearly a work in progress, but something really needed to be done. Many of the, you'll find almost genetically, there are a number of people in the Baba world who genetically have a feel for history and the need to both archive and record what's happened during this Advent. Because people are really going to be interested in another couple hundred years. And they're going to say, why didn't those people say blah, blah, blah? And they'll make up things. Anyway, a terrific job of research, and I had some, in fact, I had some questions. We'll probably have discussions to try to put together the pieces that we have in Australia, and some of the pieces we have from Francis's correspondence with both Rabia Martin and Murshida Duce in the United States. When we have all of Rabia Martin's journals now, and all of her correspondence, and that's going to that'll fill a gap. And certainly we have all of Murshida Duce's journals and correspondence, including everything from Baba. In fact, I was told to be on the hunt here for possible copies of, and I was going to ask Bernard this, any copies of communications from Francis to Baba, or Baba to Francis, that weren't CC'd about Sufism in Australia and Francis's role and all that. Now, did he turn down the 144,000 pounds? Did he ever get that? Who knows? Okay. Just to remind us of a slightly bigger picture, I happened to be listening to the ABC News, and I could not help but think that this group has been involved in some major international events this weekend. So, for the first thing, I don't think it's coincidental. The first thing, I learned that today begins Australian Mental Health Week. And we have been talking about Baba's interest in drugs. Number two, talking about the world. Last night, the Australian Air Force made its first combat flight over Iraq against ISIS. They, perhaps it's the Australian tradition, did not drop any bombs, but at least they got a good look. Thirdly, and I think definitely linked to what's happening here, today there's a council of Roman Catholic bishops who are reevaluating the church's position on very controversial issues. Abortion, gay sex, divorce, gender equality, etc. And apparently the Pope, in his introduction to those, Pope Francis of course, in his introduction to that council, told them not to place an intolerable moral burden upon the members of the church. Now, if anyone also, if you're not convinced that there's some divine force emanating here, then we saw the demonstration of suffering and courage as the rabbitohs. which I believe is some kind of marsupial animal that we don't know about in the United States. After decades of waiting, won the final championship, led by a man who had a broken cheekbone at the beginning of the game and fought through. He made some sun scar progress. So the confluence of these things, I don't think it's coincidental. I'm sorry. You may think I'm an idealist, but I've seen it happen before. You start in what we one of the things people have been trying to work on and never have gotten to is a big timeline concordance of what Baba was doing, for example, at a particular time in the world, and what else was happening on those dates. We have some spectacular examples, but in terms of a systematic look, it's really kind of remarkable. And I think that's still going on. And I would say, at least that's one of the purposes of Sahaba's meetings, is to cook up the divine force that can be released and moves his work forward. We don't have a video of this on the subtle plane, but I really like to think it's true. All right, so a little bit, I'm going to focus most on the newest stuff regarding Sufism Reoriented in America. And we're going to have a little, just a Jim and David edit of a video of a very recent event which symbolizes what the American Sufis are doing. The history of Sufism in America, which obviously includes Francis, is pretty well documented. And this, in the Glow magazine of winter, fall, and summer of 2009, it's a pretty complete history, including, as Michael has done, the original drawings by Baba and his copies of his letters. So it's really not an interpretation, the handwriting that he dictated of the Sufi Charter in 1952. And so a lot of you can read all of these statements. There's not a lot of, there was a lot of misunderstanding about it, but there's not a lot of controversy about it. And it was pretty clear. I was just reading a piece, for example, of a transcript of a 3-hour talk that Baba had with Francis and Ivy Duce about the role of the new Sufism in the world. And one of the things that he made clear was he gave the same kind of credit to Inayat Khan for starting Sufism in the West. And that made it possible for Rabia Martin to link up with Norina Machiavelli and ultimately Mayor Baba. And ultimately, you can see the links from Australia. So, Inayat Khan, if you look at his material, it's very sweet and very good and very well written. But you can see how that was not going to be complete enough as a spiritual path, absent a very advanced teacher. Now, I did say something that I thought everybody knew, but perhaps they didn't. And that is, when Inayat Khan died and had written to Rabia Martin to say that she was his successor, the vast majority of the then Sufi world under this international society said, no way. Are you kidding me? This is a Muslim male tradition from the East, generations of spiritual lineage. And he's going to give it to an American? It's bad enough. Woman? Outrageous. Jewish? Forget it. 95% of them, more left. And just, right back and forth. This can't be. There's no way this can be. And
I was so.
despite the, despite the orientation of at least news of some validation of this, they all met, I believe, in Holland and say, we cannot accept this. And they appointed one of Inayat Khan's brothers, I believe his name was Mahbub. He was to be the next Murshid. They just said, go ahead, Mahbub, take it. Well, Mahbub really didn't have the stuff, even for those folks. And they eventually picked Vilayat Khan, who was another brother. And that Sufi movement continued, minus some Americans, and mysteriously, minus the Baron. And we don't know yet why. He's the only European that I've ever heard of who went along with this wild scheme. Now, in fact, later, one of his Murshid, his name is Murshid Madani, who was at that time probably among the most popular spiritual figures in India. He had like a subscription list to a spiritual newsletter of hundreds of thousands, and was also a musician, and was essentially a part of the royalty of the then prince and princesses of the Hyderabad area. Very, very well respected. Put out a notice in his own handwriting for all the newsletters, whoever wanted to know, that on X day before Inayat Khan's death, Inayat Khan had told him that his successor was to be then Ada Martin of San Francisco. And that was definite, clear, and Murshid Madani gave his love and blessing to this selection. Well, that didn't beat the American Jewish woman thing for the most of the international Sufi movement. So then, if you can imagine what was maybe a robust international membership, maybe in the several hundreds, maybe in the thousands, shrunk pretty quickly. Then the second blow. Rabia Martin discovers Meher Baba. Oh my God. Now here you've got, this is a group who's really devoted. Some of them had met in Inayat Khan back and forth, either in the United States or in Paris. Oh, why was Inayat Khan in the West? Murshid Madani said, pick up your stuff, pick up your instruments, your job to introduce the West to Sufism. And like the Baron, he had to do it alone. Now his cover, he was a very, very talented musician, and he would dress up in very great Indian garb and really be, fine Indian performances, Indian music performances, and then give lectures Sufism. That's how he had some sponsors who would offer him venues. But it was a very, I guess if you're on the fifth plane, it's not that courageous, but even for that, it was probably inconvenient. So the fact that Inayat Khan must have told the Baron, given him the same message, to introduce Sufism to Australia, would account for the same phenomena when Baba told people in Australia and also in the United States to spread his message to audiences that were not exactly going to be receptive, and even if 4 or 5 people showed up, to do it. I do have good news. If any of you sponsor or produce events for Mayor Baba and not many people show up, just a little anecdote. So we were giving a lot of talks in Berkeley, California, and we were getting pretty good audiences. A little drugs, a little God, really. So we had one of our friends who came in to help us learn massage for one of our companions who was quadriplegic, who was also quite clairvoyant, and had been very helpful back in Boston in working with us on the drug issue. I invited her to go to one of our talks. We rented an auditorium that held about 600 people. And I figured it was going to be a healthy audience. 30 people showed up. I was really embarrassed. And after the performance, I said, Francis, I'm sorry. I hope you found it interesting, but we had no idea so few people would be there. Usually, it's really fun to see a huge. And Francis looked at me, what are you talking about? The place was packed, packed. I said, where were you, Francis? She said, on the other planes. It was full of astral and subtle social workers, a couple of angels, and a lot of people on the other side who were working with adolescent problems. And she was not. So from then on, I was like, I don't know who's here. If you're a deceased Bible lover, I always wanted to ask about this. Would you attend the Sabbath? I would. I haven't had the nerve yet to ask her, Murshid, if deceased Sufis were also in attendance at the classes, and if you had to apply before you died. Anyway, it's a great similarity in terms of this kind of initial work that Baba asked, but in the early days, happened through Inayat Khan Sufism. Anyway, so blow number 2 comes, and you pretty much probably know the story of how Rabia Martin heard about Baba, heard a lecture of an arena at Match Ballet, again in San Francisco. It's all linked together. And really spent a long time making sure he was the Kutub, because she was very concerned that she did not want her students in any way misled. Her few students at that point. But now we have to do more research. There was a group in Brazil, and there were some people who stuck with Rabia Martin in Brazil, in Rio. I think we should go down and research that, right? Definitely. Yeah, I think so. Anyway, she didn't talk about it for a long time to her murids, her students. But then, after spending time with Kitty and Elizabeth and writing to Baba writing back to her, she was absolutely convinced. And she announced it to her students. Bong! Then another whole set of students dropped off, saying, look, and there's some very interesting letters back and forth from some of her students. I mean, well written, well sincere. Look, this fellow may be a fine spiritual figure, but this order is built around Inayat Khan's work. And you promised to fulfill this work. And, you know, great letters back and forth. But she lost a lot of students. You know that she found out about Meher Baba and knew he was the Khatub and had, MacKie, you showed her 1939 visit. There was a time when she went around the world. I mean, this is a woman who's the wife of a pharmacist. She didn't have a PhD. She was very, very well educated and of course carried a lot of charge. But she said, I gotta go meet the Sufis of the world. And remarkably enough, even though her heritage didn't fit the thing, she was very, very well received in India, Persia, Iran, and around the world, and treated as a teacher. It's amazing. Eastern people know when somebody's authentic, and they know on a level that we Westerners don't know. I mean, you just don't automatically. Somebody walks down the street, and they're advanced people in India know this, right? I've actually seen it happen. Anyway, so then she gets seriously ill, and she can't make it. She can't make it to India. And as she understands that her condition is terminal, she appoints Ivy Duce, one of her senior students, as her successor, after she had introduced Ivy Duce to Meher Baba's work. And she was one of the few who immediately resonated. And Rabia says, when I die, you have to go. You have to go to India. You have to ask him to take over. He's the Khatub. He's the boss in the Sufi world and all the other worlds. And she did pass away. She was not wealthy at all. She had a few students who later became recognizable Baba people. Don Stevens was one. And, of course, Francis, Francis was in the appropriate lineage, even though he would have been busted by the international Sufi movement, right? So he had the stuff to be the Murshid of Australia. And if you look at the transcripts of Baba's conversations with he and Murshid Duce, there was no question about it. That he carried the spiritual authority and the ability to obey Baba sufficiently so that Baba could have taken responsibility for a totally new brand of Sufism in Australia. Now, so Murshid Duce goes Murshid Duce finally makes it to Meherazad. Her husband was a kind of a geologist, oil executive, and diplomat to the Middle East. And she and Charmian were able to go on one of his trips to Saudi Arabia and sneak over to India. Well, that's pretty well cataloged to her whole interaction. Well, the main part of it was Murshida got there and said, okay, this is it. We're now Baba lovers at this point now. So Ivy Duce is appointed. A whole other majority of the Sufis under Rabia Martin fall off, right? I said, well, what's going on here? And the international Sufi movement, oh my God, there's another woman from America we never heard of, and now they're interested in this Indian we know nothing of, who's Persian, oh God knows, you know. They're not paying any attention now. They're not serious at all about anything that's going on with Sufism and this other lineage. So she kind of thinks, you know, it's over, and you know, the students sort of left. Which I'm very many will just relate to Baba, and there's no need for Sufism. Well, so she gets there, and Baba says, "No, you can't quit. I'm not of that level. I'm not a movement. I can't do it." Baba says, "You got to do it." I'm paraphrasing here. He doesn't use these words. But the upshot is, I want you to go back. You've got to continue the work there. I will help you, and I will redo the whole thing. And in the history, which you can follow, basically, he just ditched the entire history, practices, and literature of the lineages of Sufism that were both in the United States, and for that matter, in Islam, and for that matter in Australia, and started it over, basically. And you'll see in the history, and there's a lot of transcripts of letters, that the Sufism he was talking about had really nothing to do with the Sufi traditions that we had known about. It was a path. The path that he particularly liked was the path of love. He would like that, and it was the path of resonating with figures like Hafiz and Rumi, and if you flip forward, Francis. So the next series of things, and again, it's very well documented, is that after Baba's accident and Prague, Oklahoma, he spent most of his free hours working on the charter and the organization of what Adi Rani came up with the name was going to be Sufism Reoriented, and it was the big Sufism Reoriented, not the little Sufism Reoriented. It was the entire world of the path of love, representing the possibility of a spiritual school, would be rewritten. And Baba said he's willing to do this for any of the major paths to God. He would have done it for Vedanta, if there was anybody to carry on the work, if anybody was really dedicated to him. And they gave it a shot. It lasted about 5 years. Because they just didn't have anybody who could really carry it out. So times were then tough. I mean, you can see in a lot of the Baba literature what Sufism Reoriented after it was implemented in 1952. The same year that God Speaks was published, the same year that Myrtle Beach Center was started, actually opened. It was basically a small Baba group, mostly in San Francisco with a few people in Washington. She had very few people. She got a couple extra people who had been associated with Baba and then wanted to work in a group environment, but she kept writing to Baba saying, "Baba, nothing's happening," you know. And she's being shuttled back between San Francisco and Washington because of her husband. And Baba keeps writing, be patient, they will come, they will come. So it took a long time for the Sufism in America to establish a presence that was distinguishable, really, from the general Baba activity. When I first met Murshida Duce and Don Stevens at the same trip, La Dimple. I think it was 1965. That's the only real Baba activity was going on in the San Francisco Bay Area. The real outreach activity, classes, seminars, talks, eventually the anti-drug work. And then there was a burst, the hippies came, the old dopers came en masse, and 20, 30, 40 of the scruffiest looking Baba lovers you ever saw. And Murshida, Duce and Don Stevens all said their first job was to like clean them up and get them working and get them educated.
What year was this?
This would have been about 1960, 65, 66, 67, 68. I was one of them. I was educated but scruffy. Totally undisciplined group, but enthusiastic. And it was kind of strange. And here was this, then probably 60-year-old, kind of traditional conservative-looking woman who was dealing with all these long-haired hippies and dopers, and they were fine with it. They loved it. They were attracted to her. And so by the time, in the late 60s, 68, the group probably was about, I would say, totally was about 100 people. And things started to expand. Now, Baba had worked out both the spiritual and the secular part of how Sufism Oriented should operate. We really got into the details. Operating with a board of directors, 501c3 nonprofit corporation. A couple of questions would come in like, what happens if the board of directors disagrees with the Murshid? Baba says, well, that's no problem, you just change your seat. So that the spiritual authority goes with the teacher, and the secular organization is built around it. I grant you now at this point, the board of directors is handpicked, but it is democratically elected still. So the other thing was the charge and the purpose. So he established at once kind of a model for what would be called the spiritual school or a spiritual training, based completely on Meher Baba's work, devotion to him, and recommendations for related reading. So that any member of Sufism Reoriented would have to accept Meher Baba as the avatar, because it was his group. And Murshida Duce, at the beginning, then she started to have students with real problems. And one of the things she was concerned about was giving appropriate guidance to them. So she kept writing to Baba, and he kept saying, look, I told you, I will cover you for any mistakes you might make with your students. And just be honest to me in the charter, don't worry about it, you're covered. I've chosen to keep you veiled, it's all right. You can, but you'd ask questions about, major things, properties, or things you would normally ask Baba about. And Baba, of course, gave the rights to edit and publish and keep the rights to God Speaks. And I think also either Beams or Life at its best, I forget. And Murshida Duce was one of those preserver types. In fact, some people used to call her Ivy Posterity Duce. She wanted to keep everything. and everything in very good order. In a meeting in New York, Don Stevens brought up the issue of succession. Bob had said he wanted Sufism Reoriented to be a safe, stable organization under his guidance for the next 700 years until he came again. So Don said, well, what about succession? I mean, you wrote in the charter. You wrote in the charter. We have to have an illumined Murshid or Murshida. Murshid, of course, the masculine, Murshida is feminine. And where's the guarantee? He didn't say it that way, but he says you will guarantee, won't you, that we will have an illumined Murshid all through the 700 years. And Baba, I saw the transcript. It's much better than I'm saying. And Baba kind of smiles and says, are you asking me that I have to be aware each of the next 700 years that there's no gap in the Murshids of this order? And Don says, yes, that's what you wrote. Baba smiled and said, all right. I and God will work this out ourselves. We'll work it out. So that's one of the most unusual parts of Sufism Reoriented as a Meher Baba group. It's one that has to have a teacher that is illumined. Now, I had discussion with people why this is true. It's not a good idea to give people spiritual advice if you don't know what the hell you're talking about. And Baba has said many times, to the would-be gurus of the world, you're going to get some really bad karma if you set yourself up to be what you are not. Because you then get the karma of your bad advice. Fortunately, none of this group, we never give bad advice, and nobody believes us anyway, so it's really not dangerous. And also to students, don't just go around to gurus and saints, because two things. And again, there's always the backstory for Meher Baba. The obvious reason you don't go to lesser saints or gurus is it distracts you from him. That's number one, right? Number two, they may be not advanced and give you really bad advice. But the third is another interesting one. Third is that they might even be spiritually advanced, but the ordinary ego cannot keep necessarily lesser figures out of their minds when they have satisfied their curiosity. I'll give you an example. There was a Baba lover who went to see a reasonably authentic spiritual figure who happened to be traveling in Canada. And it wasn't that he was just curious. And what happened was, certainly this spiritual figure honored the fact that Meher Baba was who said he was. But our companion couldn't get this guy's picture out of his mind. And he just kind of learned that there were problems that were more esoteric than the obvious problems in Baba lovers connecting with people who might not be authentic or who might not be on a different path. Now, having said that, Meher Baba often sent people back to their gurus, their teachers. That was not Meher Baba. In other words, he delegated responsibility in many, many cases. He says, follow your master. He says, okay, I'm there, It's kind of like good corporate delegation of responsibility on occasion. All right, coming back to this. The other reason for an illumined master is it's almost impossible to give binding spiritual guidance on important problems unless you know the person's past lives. All right? Unless you know what the karmic connections are. Unless you can see what the consequences of past action has been. And for example, Murshida Duce in the early days told gay people to wait for the next Murshid because she couldn't understand where they were in gender transitions from past lives and wouldn't know whether to encourage or discourage or wouldn't know what to do with that. So they did wait, and they're all fine now. Happy. So that was a terribly important thing, and Baba chose the sixth plane as the best state of illumination for these merchants because that encompassed the plane that encompassed not only thought but feeling, and this was a path of love. All right. So, just like in the old days, so things, and you can ask questions about all of this. It is expected that the orders has to be small enough so that the teacher can interact personally with all of the students. It would keep Sufism reoriented down to perhaps 500 people or less. Which it is now. And Baba had chartered basically a lot of tasks, including publication and spreading Baba's word and doing creative arts, etc., as well as the kind of intense training of students who couldn't stay away. And one of the characteristics, that somebody was giving an example, I think it was Rumi or somebody else, of this kind of order is, we discourage people from having anything to do with it as students, just to see what happens. Because it's tough. I mean, part of it is you have to obey the teacher. And in a disobedient world, it's difficult to do that unless there's a strong connection. So all the people in the order and now have both two things: have a connection to the teacher on a very deep level that they can't put away. What's the old Sufi? Run if you can. Leave if you possibly can. And people say can't. The other thing is that they're in the majority placed in either San Francisco or Washington, because much of the work of Sufism Reoriented, apart from the internal work, is outreach work and needs a lot of group discipline, group harmony, group coordination, and group activity. That is not to say that there aren't people connected with Sufism in other places who, you can get tapes and things like that, but the goal is to be very, very close. So I wanted to actually bring you up on some stuff that you wouldn't be reading. I mean, everything I've talked about is in the Baba literatures so far. There was a controversial period with Sufism Reoriented. Same thing happened. So Murshida Duce knew that she was getting she was in her, I think, 80s. If we looked around, frankly, among our friends in the Sufi order, there wasn't anybody Murshida character. I mean, they'd have to be unveiled and unrolled very quickly. And you don't do that because in the same way that the avatar took years, to come down, to get it so that it could function in a physical body. And if you're a sixth planar and you're asked to be a Salik and you're asked to interact with people on their level, it's a very difficult thing to do, so it's not instantaneous. The whole configuration of consciousness has to be changed. So what happens is, somebody comes on the scene who comes out of apparently nowhere in the Baba world. A professor of psychiatry, very charismatic, very wise, very compassionate man out of the University of Maryland, who's in his 40s, who had enough vibratory charisma to have a group of both counselees and companions around for talks about life, etc. He went to dinner at a Baba lover's house, sees the picture of Baba, and that's it. Completely gets unveiled. 3 years of incredible suffering. Can't work. At times when he's blind. And yet the energy of that kind of divine force is so obvious that there's a small group of people around him. And he immediately accepts and later is in inner contact with Meher Baba and does whatever Baba says. And he hears a message to go see Ivy Duce in California and help her in any way you can. Who's Ivy Duce? In his ordinary life, he never heard of her, doesn't know what she does, never heard of Sufism. But does it, goes out, and Murshid Duce works with him and tests him out pretty much for a couple of years. Introduces him to Sufis who are a little skeptical. But then it turns out, then she says, look, I want you to tell me everything you know about sanskaras. She was very interested in sanskaras. And he would lay it out because he could see it. Anyway, she knew he was the next Murshid. Unusual, came from nowhere. The Baba community, much of it freaked out. It's one thing to have, people who've already been to India, It's nothing. So it comes out of nowhere. So I would say we, just like the other transitions, I think about 15% of the Sufism Reoriented membership dropped out. They didn't feel a connection. And so for about 10 years, and in fact the Mandali helped out. Mandali stoked the fire, some of them. Now, the only Mandali who really knew the real story of Sufism was Adi, Abdul Ghani, and Maraji. The others really didn't deal with the correspondence. They hadn't read the charter, for that matter. They helped stoke a lot of suspicion and warned the Baba lovers not to go near these people. There were rumors, for example, that in this James MacKie, that he would hypnotize people, and he was a black magician, and all of the Sufis were under a spell. And it was marvelous, marvelous rumors. One was, they took down all the pictures of Meher Baba. That was true, we were painting. All kinds of stuff. Enough so that even I, and I'm a nice person, aren't I, was blacklisted from talking to Baba groups, by Baba groups. Northern California group is still a little on edge. Because they were told not to have anything to do with Sufism Reoriented. It was really fun on one level. It was a real test, but it turned out to be absolutely necessary. And we understood later, number one, it kept Sufism Reoriented from being flooded with applicants. Number two, it generated an immense amount of oppositional energy, which in Sufi teaching is absolutely necessary to move the group and the Baba work forward. That's how Colonel M.S. Irani gets on the tower, right? If there's not trouble, he makes the trouble. You've got to have that energy. It's the same kind of thing as that's why your worse than scars have to come up. They are just nuclear. They're the ones you want supplemented. Well, a magic moment comes, and it's over. It happens when Adele Wolkin of the LA group writes to Mani and says, look, we'd really like to have Charmian then Knowles come down and tell her story about Baba, etc. But I know we're banned from having Sufis. Could we have an exception? And Mani writes back, what's wrong with you? How could you possibly think that Charmian wasn't welcome, that all the Sufis weren't welcome? It's shameful to think, where'd you get that idea? And then suddenly, all of the mandala shifted and said, what are you talking about? Murshid MacKie went to India several times after that. And Erich comes up and says, Jim, I have to apologize. I have to apologize for what I said, but Baba told me to say it. And Murshid said, absolutely he did. That's exactly what you had to do, and it was exactly the right thing to do. And since then, things have really calmed down. Murshid MacKie worked with one of his former students in the psychology program for many, many years, and we could kind of see her transformation. And when he knew he was passing away, and once you get an illumined Murshid, Baba says they have the right to bump one person up to the sixth plane. That's all he can do. I don't know if she needed bumping or not, but he appointed her. And the atmosphere has changed. I mean, she had accompanied Murshid MacKie to India several times. And she's really a likable personality. I mean, on this level, and didn't threaten anybody. So things have been going relatively smoothly. And Bauji was very important in this. Bauji was having none of the conflict. And he wouldn't attend the Baba group in Washington or San Francisco unless he also attended the Sufi group. And he wanted to, he really encouraged joint meetings. And at the end, when we were in India, he told everybody, you follow Murshida. I mean, she has the authority. You follow her. Don't make any mistake about it. Now, that's just the technical stuff. The interesting stuff now is a switch in the last maybe 5 years to more outreach to the general community and service projects. This has to do with the implementation. Remember I talked about descendant spirituality? So ironically, now what we used to call charity work, social service, etc., has a different meaning. It is now the implementation of the new humanity into the real world. into the real illusion, I'm sorry. Freddie keeps me knowledgeable of the illusion here. So there have been some very ambitious projects. One of them is Murshida will identify problems and say we have to do something about it. But having to do something about it doesn't mean taking over the world. It means developing a model which can be replicated, which has the highest principles of spirituality associated with it. So one of the things she identified was 1/4 of the people in our county, it's about near Walnut Creek, California, were under the poverty line. And most of them had food stamps. Food stamps are things you can trade for food. That you can trade for bad food, basically, and cheap food. And not much of it. There were charity food kitchens and food banks around that really could not, didn't have the stuff, didn't have the basic fresh food or fresh produce to give to the poor people. So she told our students in California, let's start a food rescue program. Which meant to get willing contributors, like grocery stores, you know, they can't, in the US, they just can't keep their food forever. It's perfectly fine, but they just can't keep it. To get the stuff they ordinarily throw away, especially fresh food, produce, fruits, even meats, dairy, and transport them directly to the food kitchens to make it available to poor people, same day. And so a survey was done of all the food kitchens, of their needs, sent people out to places. Are there Walmarts in Australia? No. It's good. I don't know. Very big, huge stores. Bakeries, and a lot of people, a lot of the owners really liked this idea. They also got kind of a tax credit, you know, and they got good PR, and they also felt good about it. So within 4 months, we were transporting 2 tons, what's the Australian, of food a day. With 110 volunteers all over the county, and soon became the largest food rescue program in the entire area, all volunteer. No one was being paid. We got donations of some refrigerated trucks, and the goal is to ultimately turn it over to the community and replicate that model in other places. It was also, she got very concerned in Washington about homeless people, and especially who had mental health issues, and started a little project, which the food rescue program is called the White Pony Express, and the homeless mental health program is called the White Pony Inn, in which we experimentally take in willing homeless people, surround them with loving, supporting companionship with mental health problems, get them back in good medical condition, and get them either functional or back to where they liked it, on the streets, but in much better shape.
In what context is that done?
There's collaboration with governmental social workers who keep an eye on the services that they could access. But for example, some of our companions' houses in Washington are used in spare rooms, etc. We make sure they get fed and have recreational activities that are very, very positive, etc. It's very tough.
So it's individual students that take people into their homes?
Yes, that's right. but there are teams that help out. There's also a mobile general store where good clothing is collected, unneeded clothing, and then taken out into the community with a particular objective to give at least the poor people one really good outfit, where if they were interviewing for jobs or had to make presentations that were important, they could really look good. A lot of them really don't look too good. That's another one. And the most ambitious one, and we're going to have a clip now, is interesting in two ways. It goes back to St. Paul's Church. There was the Sufi chorus in California is very, very good and has gotten invitations to sing at many churches. We are building a new center, a very extensive building which will be able to incorporate everything we're doing, including the administrative parts of a school we run for kids, 400 kids. It's been there for about 20 years, called the Maher Schools. And to which there was huge opposition, huge neighborhood opposition. I mean, they had the Children's March against the Sufis, who wanted to put something architecturally beautiful into our semi-rural neighborhood, who even threatened to build sidewalks. Terrible thing. And they had posters of minarets and machine guns and stuff like that. It was great. It was fun. Anyway, finally got it through. So, but that required personal contact to over 4,000 households in the area. And of course, to help explain what the building was going to be like, they had talked about Mary Baba. Got in trouble in certain households, but nonetheless. So, as a result of that, for the first time, the Sufism movement had always been under the radar in the United States. Very quiet, nobody knew what was going on. Kind of like, does everybody in Mumbai know about Avatar's Abode?
No.
No, yeah, right, same thing. Well, we had to go public. It went so public that the biggest city council meeting in the history of the county was the final vote on whether to approve the construction of the new center. Live television. So it was out there. Part of the presentation to the council was the spiritual background of Meher Baba and how the architecture of the new center reflected the shapes and the functions, the highest divine principles. Well, cat was out of the bag. So the backers against the opposition turned out to be the Interfaith Council of the county. So all of the, except for the fundamentalists, all the other religious groups supported this. And there was a lot of exposure to the chorus, who began to get invitations from many of these churches to sing. Because many of the priests and rabbis said, well, and we would pick songs that were universal, that they felt such joy and love that they wanted that in their church. They didn't care about who they were. There then began a connection with several Roman Catholic churches. And Murshida Connor had a particular interest in San Francisco and a particular interest in St. Francis as the sole Western perfect master that Baba had particular interest in. And the ways of realizing the final things is, and if you have the love for me that St. Francis had for Jesus, you would not only realize me, you would please me. And there are other St. Francis fans in California. Anyway, it led to a collaboration between some of the folks in the Catholic community and the Sufis supporting a re-appreciation of Francis. And that morphed into support of the recreation of what is now called the Nuovo Porziuncola, which is the small chapel that St. Francis built. And a woman in San Francisco got permission from the Franciscans, after a long fight, to actually recreate a model of it, actual size model, and even gave them one of the original stones that St. Francis had used for it. And then strangely, and I don't know how it happened, Pope Benedict declared that site in San Francisco one of the 5 sacred places of the Roman Catholic Church in the world, which included things like St. Peter's, St. Mark's Cathedral, which seemed a little unusual. But Murshida kind of said, yeah, that's Bob is doing this. That morphed into a program. Murshida was very concerned about the underprivileged minority kids in the area, and decided to create a day of inspiration, recreation, and supportive joy for these kids who had some never been out of San Francisco, in a kind of a Renaissance fair motif that had Francis as the guiding principle of it. And the program included over 4,000 children over a year. And the scene we're going to see today is one of the programs that we had 2,000 kids do. We had 400 volunteers. And it starts with, there are all kinds of activities afterwards, and we packed 2,000 lunches for them. And it starts with a play about the life of Francis. And the program is basically called Francis in the Schools. One of the things you won't see, but we have another discovery, is that somehow in the trip to Assisi, the friars who run Assisi got very interested in this project. One of the friars, Alessandro, turns out to have a fantastic singing voice, and was discovered by the same producers that did the Beatles and the Bee Gees. And it's an operatic, is a devotional singer, and is still a friar at the friary. And he volunteered to come out and sing at several of these programs, which he will be doing in the next 5 to 10 days. In Washington, we're doing 3 of these programs. Now, the whole thing is 90 minutes long, and even the play is 60 minutes long. But I gave directorial discretion to Jim and David, if you wanted to muscle in on it, to select maybe 10 or 15 minutes of the play to give you a sense of both the acting and the choruses. Now note that we're very careful, though they know us as Sufism Reoriented, our organizer, Murshid there's been an actual organization called Francis in the Schools, is the director of Francis in the Schools. So it's not like hitting him with that. We've gotten a lot of cooperation with some of the Roman Catholic bishops. Within the bishopry, there are Bible lovers. And of course, they're a little more helpful even. So I think this is in a sense, the most reflective of at least give you a taste of the external work. And appreciate what has happened from the very first introduction of so-called Sufism into the West. Now, one little known thing is that the Sufi lineage from which the Inayat order came and from which Baba took the platform started with Moiden Chisti and went through several perfect masters, many of which you visited when you go to India, I mean their tombs. Then there was a skip. The next perfect master in line was a student of the last perfect master in this lineage. And a couple hundred years came by, and he got reincarnated as Sai Baba of Shirdi. So Sai Baba became the next perfect master of this Sufi lineage. So Baba had fixed it all the way back to be able to do this. So let's give it a shot. I just pivot here.
Do the kids sit still for all of this?
What?
Do the children sit still for all of this?
They watch how receptive they are at the play, and then they go out and they have games and music and dancing and all kinds of activities. And they have a lot of fun.
Alan, we could bring the 90-minute version if you like tonight, and people could watch it at our house.
It's pretty long. I think this will give you a taste. I mean, I'm sure you get the kids there. You saw some adults who were there, the teachers or parents who accompanied the children. And they just had a fabulous time. These are kids who, and some of their parents who really never had gotten out of the inner city at all. And you notice that St. Francis talked about the great king. And that seemed like a wonderful non-sectarian reference to God that wouldn't offend any of the religions that attended there. And of course, in the fair, the wolf appears and the kids get to play with the tame wolf, etc. So that's kind of a picture of the fairs. And while I'm here in Australia and New Zealand, there'll be 3 of them in Baltimore. We invited the president's wife, but we never know if she'll come. And you don't know till the last minute because of security and all that. But also the friar is coming back from Assisi, and he's also going to, we're sponsoring him singing at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. He's a sweet guy, great voice. Got a couple of CDs out of devotional music. So anyway, if you asked what was on the plate of Sufism Reoriented right now in America, this is kind of a taste of it. And meanwhile, obviously, with people working hard on external projects, all of the stuff, all of the sanskaras and all of the phenomena we've talked about, that's getting worked through. And people have to agree on things, and I just got a text saying that they had created 2,000 ribbons of the wrong color. And had to redo it. And those kind of things happen. Anyway, I think we've kind of run over, haven't we?
Just a couple of hours, but that's
Okay,
nothing.
just a couple hours. Yes, Charmaine.
We were very privileged a few years ago. Murshida invited us to watch them practicing one of Baba's birthday plays. It was the one about people finding Myrtle Beach, and it had Rabia Martin.
Yes.
It was a wonderful play. What I wanted to say was how intimately involved the Murshida was in the whole process, to the costumes, to everything. It was just unbelievable. The way they walk, the way they wore their hair. She is just so involved in everything that the Sufis do, and it's just wonderful to be a part of it.
Yeah, it's actually amazing. There's no detail that's too small. It's kind of like, well, we're doing this for Baba, it's got to be exactly right. And so one of the purposes of those were not our better actors. Those are the younger people. But what it was a way of kind of musical comedy drama that took Mayor Baba in America and kind of could give the younger ones, and also some of the public that came in, a real feel of what happened when like Darwin Shaw and those were working in the mosquito jungle of Myrtle Beach, etc. And then what happened in Prague, and so that's kind of in a kind of a video history also, trying to preserve that. And because we're, a lot of the baby boomers are getting a little old here in America, so there's a whole new crop that really don't have that complete background of what Baba did and what happened in America. And of course, there's always a reference to Australia somewhere because of the critical link. And if you look at it, Baba's doing one hemisphere in North America, the other hemisphere in Australia. And those cables, India as a link, very, 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 very powerful. And it's interesting. Europe is pretty much old stuff now. We're not going to see, at least Murshid doesn't expect, huge Baba activity in Europe. That's kind of the old world. And that, not to say there aren't going to be Baba lovers, but I mean the energy now, the energy is in the United States, North America. We're getting a little buzz in Mexico.
China.
That's if you're betting on the future, buy stock in yeah. The tradition is certainly here. Okay, well, I guess people have deserved their tea by now. Again, I want to thank so much everyone who has made this day so lovely for me, and David, who took care of all the details, Charmaine, who has needled everyone into magically accepting interviews, Bernard for the use of his veranda and his wisdom, and Michael, this is a great piece of work, and really all of you that I've met and who have been helpful, and kudos to Bill and Diana for their great work over the years too. So, I hope you enjoy all the work you did for the Avatar this weekend. Just read about it in the newspaper. So, we'll see you at tea. Let's do a beloved God prayer. And then,
Can I just on behalf of us all, obviously thank Allan for coming out. It's been absolutely wonderful. It's from Friday through till Monday, we've never had the sort of attendance as we have had this year. It's been quite amazing, and